Well, good day to all of you. It is January 8th, and we are looking at session 8 today, Genesis 25 through 26. We finished up last time with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah and the beginning of their life together. And now in the next two chapters, we move forward and we begin with Abraham. Sarah has died, long been buried in the cave of Machpelah. And we're told that Abraham marries someone else, Keturah, we're told. And in fact, he marries another wife who are referred to as concubines. And what that means is not that they're not married, it's just that they have secondary status. Sarah will always be his wife, but he marries and he has more descendants. Even in his old age, he has more children. And the purpose of this particular genealogy at the beginning of chapter 25 is to get us to Ishmael and descendants and the story of Jacob and Esau. Remember, one of the things that God has promised to Abraham is not just to bless him with a nation, Israel, but to make him a blessing for all nations. And so these continued genealogies remind us how Abraham is connected to a lot of these other nations that later on will surround the people of Israel. And so that there will be a connection between the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael and other children. So that's the purpose of these genealogies, to let everybody know that there is this connection back to Abraham. So after that genealogy, the mention of his marriages, we're told that Abraham dies. And verse 7 says, this is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. So this is quite the long life, as reported to us, and he dies. It was considered in that day to live a long life was a sign that you were faithful to God, that you were faithful, and so you are granted long life. And he is full of years, which means he's lived a productive life. He's lived the life that is well lived. And so we get another genealogy about his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Now they gather together finally, probably hadn't seen each other in years, but they do gather together to bury their father with Sarah at the cave of Machpelah. And after the death of Abraham, we're told that God blesses his son, and Isaac settles at Beer-lahai-roi. He settles in another place. And then we get to Ishmael's descendants. So here we have a genealogy of Ishmael's descendants that serves two purposes. One is it serves the purpose of reminding us that God said he would bless Abraham's son Ishmael, and he has done so. And so he has many descendants, and descendants actually who are people of note, notable people who are royalty and who come to have wealth. The second purpose of this genealogy is again a reminder that Abraham, God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham to make of him many nations. So again, these descendants are a reminder that God has blessed Israel not only with the nation of Israel, whom God has chosen as the chosen nation to bring salvation to the world, but there are other nations around that can trace their lineage back to Abraham. So we get there and we get to Ishmael and his descendants, and then we come back to the story of Isaac. And we get another genealogy, a little brief genealogy. This is verse 19 of 25. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what really is important to note is right now, Genesis focuses a lot on Abraham. And in fact, you might remember way back in chapter 12, the writer gives the genealogy of Abraham's father, Terah. But really, the purpose of the genealogy is not to highlight the descendants of Abraham's father, but to highlight the descendants of Abraham. He's the one that's been chosen. When you get to the genealogies of Isaac, you really don't get the genealogy there presented so much for the sake of Isaac, but as his son Jacob. In fact, when we read these narratives from Abraham through Jacob, the least amount of space is given to Isaac. Isaac is kind of the middle child of the patriarchs, right? He gets some press, but not a lot. And really, what the writer wants to do is get to Jacob, and we'll be dealing with Jacob for a while, and in fact, probably dealing with him. I believe it's up through chapter 36. So we've got a ways to go in dealing with Jacob. So in verse 19, we get the story of the birth of, beginning with the birth of Isaac or the birth of Esau and Jacob. So Rebekah, like Sarah, is not able to have children, and it's many years. And finally, there's a prayer offered, and God hears that prayer, and Rebekah conceives, and she gives birth to twins. And these twins are quite the contenders in the womb. And in fact, even inside Rebekah, they are struggling together. And here, the Lord comes to Rebekah and says, "These are two nations that are in your womb, and the two people born of you shall be divided." And they're not waiting till they're born to start the contention, to start the conflict. And one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. And so again, we see God's preference for the younger son in reference to working through them, in reference to the chosen line, that God pushes aside this idea that the elder son gets most of the privileges and most of the rights. God chooses to work through the younger. So it's time to give birth, and they come out, and Esau is the first one born, and he comes out and he's all red. His complexion is kind of ruddy. In a Semitic culture, that would have been quite the sight, to be born with fair skin and red hair. And they name him Esau. And right afterwards, here comes Jacob hard on Esau's heels. And in fact, he comes out, he's grabbing Esau's heel. It's if he is grabbed on and taken a free ride from Esau through his mother's womb and out into the world. And so they name him Jacob, which means to grasp. So we're going to call Jacob for the next few chapters Grabber. That's his name, Grabber, because Jacob is going to do exactly that. He's going to live up to his name. He's going to grab after everything in reference to his brother. He grows up and he becomes somewhat manipulative and kind of a con man. And so we have Jacob and Esau are born, and they're because they look so different, I guess we can assume they're fraternal twins. And they're very different as they grow up. Esau's a skillful hunter, we're told. He's a man of the field. He's an outdoorsman. He's a man's man. He probably goes camping and along with his hunting and fishing, and he goes hiking and he climbs mountains, and he does all those things that we might think of. He's kind of Grizzly Adams, if you will, of the two brothers. Jacob is very different. Jacob is quiet. He's a man living in tents, means he enjoys the domesticated life. He'd probably be a reader, and he would go to art museums and lectures at the university. He's very, very different. Perhaps Jacob is introverted, Esau is more extroverted, but they're very different. But the key verse here in this chapter is 28. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, this should not be interpreted to mean that Isaac didn't love both his sons and Rebekah didn't love both her sons, but they favored one son over the other. Isaac favored and gave preferential treatment to Esau because he was like him, and Rebekah gave preferential treatment to Jacob because he was like her. And so if you want to make a sibling rivalry even worse, then just have the parents engage in favorable treatment of one son over the other. And so that's what they do. And they just highlight the conflict between them. So we move then on to the story of Jacob. He's cooking stew. He comes in from the field. Esau comes in from the field, and he's famished. It could very well be what's going on here is the encampment went out as a hunting party, and so what would happen is you'd have men go out to hunt for the population of the encampment, and somebody, of course, would have to be the cook on the chuck wagon, so to speak. And so perhaps that is Jacob's job. And he's cooking stew, and it's not yet time for dinner probably, or something like that, or maybe Jacob is out by himself and he's not part of the hunting party, and he comes in from the field, he's famished, and he says to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished. So notice the play on words of red stuff. Esau is red, fair complected, the stew is red stuff. And we get a little parenthetical note that says that when Esau says he wants some of that red stuff, we get this parenthetical note that says, therefore he was called Edom. Edom will be the country, the people who are his descendants. And we have the word here, Edom, really means red. So his descendants are known, if you will, as the Reds. And so Jacob says, sure, I'll be glad to do that. Remember, Jacob's a conniver. Jacob is a plotter. And he says, sell me your birthright. Sell me your double share of the inheritance. You sell that to me in exchange for some of this red stew. By law, the elder son gets a double share of the inheritance, right? So if you have three sons, upon their father's death, the estate is divided into thirds, or divided into quarters, and the oldest gets half of that, and then the other two sons get a quarter each. That's the way it works. So here you have Jacob and Esau. So the estate would be divided up into thirds, and Esau would get 2/3. And Jacob basically says, I'll give you some of this red stew if you sell me your birthright. You give me the 2/3 that you were going to get, and you can get the 1/3 I was going to get. And Esau, who doesn't seem to be a very thoughtful person, at least at this point in his life, and perhaps is impetuous and acts without thinking, says, well, good grief, what's all that land going to do me if I'm dead, right? I'm starving to death, right? So he's probably not starving to death, but he's probably pretty hungry. So he does what Jacob asks, and he swears to Jacob, Esau swears to Jacob, and he sells him his birthright in exchange for what we're told now is bread and lentil stew. So here's kind of even another deception on Jacob's part, that maybe what Esau is thinking, that this red-looking stew has meat in it, right? And he loves game. And yet what he ends up getting is a bowl of legumes, of beans, that's red. And so he ate, he drank, he drinks, he goes on his way, and the chapter ends that Esau despised his birthright. Now, what does that mean? It means that Esau rejected his birthright. Esau gave up his birthright. Esau stepped all over his birthright. This is an insult, actually. You're the oldest, you're the older son, and you have these benefits just because you're the older son, just because you were born first, and yet you step all over it. It's like going to the Louvre and taking the Mona Lisa off the wall and stepping all over it and just desecrating a work of art, or desecrating something that is so very important. And so he despises his birthright. He desecrates it. He makes it of no value because he's willing to sell it for a bowl of lentil stew. So we end chapter 25, get into chapter 26, and we're told there's a famine in the land. Would not have been uncommon. A famine is in the land, just like when Abraham went to Egypt because of the famine. And so Isaac goes to King Abimelech, and God appears to him in a dream and tells him, don't go to Egypt like your father. Instead, I want you to settle in this land where you are as an alien. And so he goes to King Abimelech, and God promises Isaac that he'll bless him in the midst of this. So another reminder of the promise that God made to Abraham. In fact, because of your father, he says to Isaac, I will bless you, and nations will be blessed because of you, and there'll be an inheritance. Abraham obeyed my voice, and he kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws, and I'm going to bless him. I'm going to bless you because of your father and his way of life. So maybe an important reminder of what we pass down to our children and how we live. So Isaac settles in the land of Gerar, and we get a familiar story here. There's men who come to Isaac and ask about his wife. And what do we get in verse 7? He responds to them and says, well, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, my wife, thinking, or else the men of this place might kill me for the sake of Rebekah, because she is attractive in appearance, like father, like son. So he passes off his wife as his sister, but that's not going to last for too long, because King Abimelech is going to look outside one day, and he's going to see Isaac, let's just say, having some public display of affection for his sister, Rebekah. And so King Abimelech knows the jig is up and basically confronts Isaac and says, you could have brought down God's judgment upon all of us had somebody taken your wife as his wife. And so Abimelech issues an order for everyone to stay away from Rebekah. Don't go near her, because there will be a curse upon the land if they do. So Isaac settles in that area. We're told he sows seed and he reaps 100-fold. It's just a bumper crop of a harvest, and he's starting to become wealthy. He's starting to have the wealth and the power of his father, because when you have wealth and you have animals to tend to and you have crops to tend to, you need people. And so you have servants and other people who work for you who also, in a pinch, can be a militia, so to speak. And so he's starting to become very wealthy. And the Philistines, we're told, who are in the land by this time, envy him, and they're trying to sort of push him out. They fill up the wells that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. And Abimelech comes to Isaac and says, go away from us, for you have become too powerful for us. They're afraid that he is going to use his wealth and his power to perhaps push them out of the land and take their land for himself. But Isaac departs. He doesn't want a problem. He just doesn't want a problem. He's not interested in anybody else's land. He just wants to settle there and and live his life and do what he needs to do in life. And he digs wells where he settles. And the Philistines come and they stop up the first well and they stop up the second well. And then finally he gets to the place, apparently far enough away that he digs a well and the Philistines leave it alone. And it's interesting that he names all those wells. He names those wells and places. And we're going to see at the end of the chapter, he names a place where God talks to him. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. It's something that we do today. When we have a significant event happen somewhere, we want to mark the spot, right? Like a historical marker beside the road. This is where this happened. I'm going to name this place, and you name it by whatever, to connect to whatever event. And so we do this. I remember being in Boston many, many years ago in the Old North Church. And in Boston, Paul Revere's one if by land, two if by sea church. And there was a plaque on the wall of the sanctuary commemorating by date and year the visit of Charles Wesley, one of the co-founders of Methodism. On this Sunday, in the particular date that was mentioned, he preached there. So there's a plaque commemorating Charles Wesley preaching at the Old North Church. So this is what we do. This has been done for centuries and centuries. We mark these places by names, and there's something significant about them. So Isaac settles, and he has a vision from God, and he is reminded again that he's going to be blessed because God blessed his father. And Abimelech, who previously had asked him to leave because he was afraid of him, comes to him and says, you know what, we've been kind of watching you from afar. It's real clear that your God has blessed you. It's real clear that your God is with you. And so let's make a deal. Let's make an oath that we will not harm each other. That because when you came, by the way, we didn't harm you. We let you settle in the land. So, there's probably some fear here. If Isaac's God is so clearly with him in this way, then maybe we need to get on Isaac's good side and get on God's good side. So they come and they want to make an oath. And so that's what Isaac does. He makes an oath that they'll, cooperate together and that they won't attack each other or undermine each other. And so what does Isaac do? He throws a huge feast, right? He throws a huge feast for everyone, and they eat and they drink. And in the morning, they exchange oaths, and they go, and Abimelech and his entourage go on their way. And the chapter then ends in 26, going back to Esau very briefly. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beheri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Why would they make life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah? It was generally believed that you needed to marry within your clan, within your extended family. And there would have always been extended family around. Because you worship the same God, you have the same customs. And if you marry outside your family, that can introduce things that are foreign into the family. And so that seems to be the case here, that because Esau marries two Hittites, and while the Bible does not explicitly promote polygamy of any sort, the reality is that there is some polygamy in the Bible. It is not really a result of God's will or what God wants, but it's something that happens. We'll get into that later on when we talk specifically about Solomon and his harem, and that some people mistakenly think because Solomon had many wives and David had two wives, that the Old Testament is okay with polygamy. It's really not. And in fact, the opposite is true. We'll get to that at the appropriate time. But the reality is that Esau has married two women who are Hittites, and they make Isaac and Rebekah miserable, no doubt, because they're Hittites, and this creates a problem. And the writer does not go into detail because it's kind of assumed that these kinds of marriages are going to create problems. So to do a little just kind of summing up, one of the things that we see is we see a continued theme in these stories between Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And one of those themes is that there's going to continue to be an intersection, a connection between all the nations that are descended from Abraham, all the peoples, even though Isaac and Jacob are in the chosen line. There will be nations around Israel that are also descended from Abraham and connected to Abraham. That theme continues. The theme of God working by surprise, by working through the younger son, by assisting couples in their old age to have children when they don't have any, that God continues to work in ways so that no one can say, I did it. No, Abraham and Isaac, Rebecca cannot say, we did this. This is because of us. No, you did it because God looked favorably upon you and created the circumstances for you to prosper and to flourish. We see here something that we saw a little bit in Abraham. We'll see it in more as we get to Jacob and Esau. But family dysfunction is going to play, in many ways, a negative role in how these people respond to various events. And yet God will still be able to use that, even though these families, in many ways, the patriarchs and their families are very dysfunctional from our perspective, but God manages to use it. And we just need to remember also that God not only works in surprising ways, but God works in the same kind of ways from generation to generation, because we see similar stories. Patriarchs passing off their wives as sisters, the wives of patriarchs not being able to conceive. So the one thing we will continue to get in the Bible is that God will work in expected ways, but also unexpected. That there'll always be a surprise in store, something that we hadn't anticipated. So that's the story for today. That's the devotions for today. We will begin session 9 tomorrow with Genesis chapters 27 through 29. So we're going to get the continued conflict between Jacob and Esau, to the place where Esau just wants to kill his brother for his conniving ways. Grabber will continue to grab Esau's things, if you will. And we will then get into, at the end of chapter 29, where Jacob meets his wife, Rachel, or soon-to-be wife, Rachel. So friends, thank you for your attention, and I pray God's blessings on you today. Let us pray. Gracious God, thank you again for these stories that in some ways are just all too human, but in other ways remind us that in the midst of the all too human, you still work, that you're still there, and that you continue to work through us, and you continue to work even when we're not always with you in the way that we should be. But help us in this day to be faithful to all that you have commanded us to do, and so that you might use us for your honor and glory. Hear our prayers in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, friends. Thank you. Have a great day.